Hello again. Now that we've gained some understanding of the origins of Gothic and horror, we're ready to move into our first unit. This unit is one of two that will work with the concept that the horror is out there. In other words, it originates from outside of man. We will begin in this presentation with an introduction to literature about the undead. Our sources for this presentation are Gina Whisker, L. Andrew Cooper, H.P. Lovecraft, and Rebecca Janiker. Literary critic Gina Whisker says that a great deal of horror focuses on the brutal aspects that people commit every day. These works confront us with the horrors of murder, rape, war, and the violence that we wreak on each other all over our little planet. But horror also originates from outside the actions of human beings. Whisker says that horror lies on a continuum, with natural horror, the evil works of man, on one end, and the supernatural or weird tale on the other. Natural horror questions what is seen as the norm among us and uses graphic depictions of the worst behaviors to demonstrate that horror is all around us, with its cruelty, disgusting violence, disempowerment, and invasion, all of which threaten stability. Yes, horror tales might exaggerate it, but natural horror originates in the daily headlines. But supernatural horror originates in the unconscious, the psyche, and the imagination, Whisker says. Natural and supernatural horror are different in many ways, but Whisker says they have one crucial element in common. Both work, at least in part, by taking a familiar place, person, or circumstance and altering it in some way, by sight, sound, or atmosphere, so much that it is almost unrecognizable. It defamiliarizes the familiar, and Whisker points out that when the familiar is defamiliarized, it leaves us nothing to hold on to. The world around us becomes unstable, and we all tend to have a need for stability. If supernatural horror defamiliarizes the familiar, how can we identify it? After all, as literary critic L. Andrew Cooper points out, we usually base our concept of reality on empirical data that we gather through our five senses. But supernatural horror doesn't rely on empirical data for legitimacy. The criteria for legitimacy, Cooper says, is based on the texts that have been written about the supernatural. One of the best authors of the supernatural, which he calls the weird tale, is H.P. Lovecraft. In a very famous quote, Lovecraft says, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Lovecraft says that no psychiatrist will refute that, and it establishes the dignity and genius of the supernatural or weird horror tale as a legitimate literary form. Supernatural horror appeals to people with imagination. Yes, the supernatural macabre has a narrow appeal, Lovecraft says, but he says that that's because it demands that readers have a degree of imagination and the ability to detach themselves from everyday life. Lovecraft says that few people are free enough from the spell of the daily routine to be able to enjoy supernatural horror, so they prefer literature about ordinary human feelings and events. But Lovecraft says there will always be sensitive people who are attracted to the weird tale, and even the most empirical mind is sometimes invaded by curiosity. So no amount of rationalism, reform, or psychoanalysis can quiet the thrill of the weird tale. The human attraction to supernatural horror involves a very real psychological pattern or tradition that is deeply rooted in mental experience and closely related to many aspects of the religious experience, Lovecraft says. That mental experience is too much of human biological heritage to lose its power over a very important minority of the human species, according to Lovecraft. Yes, humanity's first emotions and instincts responded to his environment. He noticed that feelings of pleasure and pain were associated with aspects of the environment that he could understand. But the universe is full of phenomena that early humans couldn't understand at all. Because they were incomprehensible, they became woven into magical interpretations and sensations of awe and fear, Lovecraft says. Dreaming also led early humans to believe in the supernatural, according to Lovecraft. And all of these conditions of the early human life of man led to a feeling of the supernatural that is so strong that the species' hereditary essence is saturated with religion and superstition, and must be considered a permanent part of man's subconscious. With the aid of science, we know more now than early man did. But there is an infinite reservoir of the unknown in the outer cosmos, Lovecraft says. There may be some common threads that help identify the supernatural or weird tale, but they don't adhere to a strict theoretical fictional model, Lovecraft says. Atmosphere, he says, is more important, because the final factor in determining the authenticity of a weird tale is that it creates a sensation of fear. Weird tales are not designed to teach or uplift humanity, or to produce a social effect, Lovecraft says. They are designed to create a sensation of fear. But as Rebecca Janiker states, supernatural and weird tales do speak to the fears that we have about our social conditions and social change. Well, I think that should give us a brief introduction to literature on the undead and a little bit about supernatural horror. If you have any questions, of course, all you have to do is drop me an email through Canvas. You know I'm always here for you, and I always want to clarify anything that I didn't make clear in the presentations.